The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
I wanted to introduce us first. I'm Laura Briggs. I'm with Metro Schools. I've been in the district about 15 years, a little bit more than that, working with primarily at-risk youth, secondary, and most of them, the population's 35–40% language minority, so quite a few. And so Joanne?
I'm Joanne Coggins, and I have worked in high school teaching gen ed Spanish and English, and then elementary ESL in everybody's Title I for the last 17–18 years, and then special ed.
So we're going to briefly explain, when you get these students, normally, how would a student learn to read in the first language? Then we're going to talk about reading in the second language, and then some of the reading disabilities from there. And then also, once we have a student that we know has a disability in the second language, what are some things that we can do to support those students? All right, so Joanne, this is your part. This is,
if you are not an elementary teacher, you might not have seen the National Reading Panel. And this is where we get our 5 pillars of reading. But this is to give you an idea. From 2000, they spent a lot of time and they tried to define what does reading look like at the elementary level and what are the most important elements. And what they've come up with is that you've got to have phonemic awareness. And for those of us that don't know what that is, that means you've got to be able to recognize the sounds that you hear in the words. So before you even read a word on a page, you've got to be able to hear the sound before you can connect it to a symbol. Phonics, and that's the synthetic part. That's applying the knowledge of what you hear to that little symbol so that you know C says K, or can say S sometimes too. Fluency, and this is a combination of reading speed and accuracy. Vocabulary. If you don't know the vocabulary when you're reading, it makes it much more difficult as you're reading the words on the page to intuit what that word should be. When we're reading, we don't always we're not looking at the individual parts of the word. A lot of times we're reading the first part of the word, or if we have to break it up, if we know the word, we're like, oh, biology, yeah, okay, got it. Comprehension. This is the 5th leg and probably the most important part, because remember, when we're learning to read, it's all about comprehension. That's where we're going. In elementary, the first 2–3 years, we're looking at reading the words on the page, but our end goal is comprehension and silent reading at that. With our EL populations, for comprehension, it's all about building the vocabulary. So there are 2 different models that you're going to look at. This first one just shows briefly that you've got to have the vocabulary. If you're working with second language populations or Title I students that haven't been exposed to a lot of things, their parents haven't spoken to them a lot, or they have a limited vocabulary, your kids are going to start out under the gun to begin with, because they're not going to recognize a lot of the words they're trying to read, or they're not going to be able to put them in context to get the meaning out of what they're reading. Word recognition. So knowing what the word is helps you recognize the word. For example, if you've never heard of would, I would like to go to the store, and you see this crazy word W-O-U-L-D on the page, you're mind blown. You're trying to read it, it doesn't follow any of the rules, and you don't recognize the word. So word recognition, accuracy, reading the actual word that's on there, and the speed of reading. So these things contribute to your reading fluency, and as you become a more fluent reader, you experience reading success. Those of you that work with children that are struggling to read and they start putting those first sentences together, you know what that looks like on their faces when they light up and they're so excited and they want to read it 5 times. And then because they're having that reading success, they're going to read more words, right? You're getting a reading volume in there, and that's what you need to learn your vocabulary, and it's all about vocabulary. The way you learn the most vocabulary, especially when you go into middle and high school, you can't teach the words one at a time. Bark, for example, you've got to be able to make inferences, and it's all about your reading volume. So that's where you get that steep vocabulary growth. That's why we teach reading, to our English language learners. I mean, they have to learn to read, right? Everybody does, but it's about the vocabulary, and that's where you get most of your vocabulary knowledge.
And I was going to say, as a secondary person, a lot of times, because we take reading for granted, it's one of those things that once you read, you cannot unread. And so I don't know if you've seen the Stroop test where it's got the names of the colors, but then the colors are different, like if the word may be green, but the word font color may be orange or whatever. If you've ever played that game to see, how quickly you could name the color versus that, that reading takes over. And so we tend to forget, because most of us in education are strong readers, a whole lot of us are. And so this miracle that takes place at the earlier grades typically is something that a lot of times we tend to forget because we take it for granted, and because once you've learned how to read, you cannot unread something. I interrupted you.
No, you're exactly right. I forgot about that. That's a good point. And it is true. I have found exactly one person with a reading disability that's in education in Hamilton County. I'm tracking her down. And I'm excited about this, because this is somebody that will really relate to children that are having difficulty learning to read. But most of us, we sat in school and you could have thrown a book past us and we've been like, oh yeah, that's how you learn to read. We just got it. All right, the next diagram explains a lot of what's going on with your secondary kids, especially if they've rolled in late, right? Maybe they never went to school and they've come in from another country, and here they are. We don't want them driving to school in 3rd grade, so we placed them appropriately, age appropriately, right? And bless their hearts, they don't even know how to open a binder. They've never seen a pencil sharpener. So they don't have these skills right here. And a lot of times in high school, I didn't know how to teach this. I didn't know what to do with this. I expected them to come knowing how to read. And if they don't, these skills are maybe a little more difficult for us secondary folks to wrap our minds around how to get those. Because before you can get those, you've got to have those before you can really get your comprehension happening. Just look at the number of things on this rope. All of these things go together to build comprehension for a skilled reader, but look at how heavy it is on this side. So you've got background knowledge. Those are the things that, for example, you're reading a story and it talks about bark and moss. But if you have not been outside and you don't know what bark and moss look like, and this happens if you're working with ELs, you know what I'm talking about, or you're from another culture, maybe you're from the desert or something and you've not seen bark and moss at all, this background knowledge is, you don't have it. It makes it a lot harder to get your vocabulary. And again, the whole game is about vocabulary. Language structures. Tell them a little bit about, what was the language you were talking about?
The Saga Karen language of Burma, if you have Burmese children, they have classifiers that they attach to nouns, or they co-locate with nouns. And so they will classify something depending on whether or not it's linear, long and thin, or they may have a classification for something that's round versus flat, 2D, 3D, 1D objects. And so one of our classmates, actually I think you were already out when he started, but he's an ESL teacher here in this area, and when he was trying to prepare the students for their science tests, and he was wanting them to classify these objects, the way that they were doing it was completely different from the way that we would typically expect. And so when he did some more digging into it, it had to do with the classifiers. So an example, I went and did a little bit of research behind it, so I'd be prepared to share that today. The example that was given was cardboard. So with Saga Karen students, the language, they might tend to classify a cardboard sheet and a cardboard box as being the same, where somebody who's an English speaker would classify a cardboard box and a plastic box because they're both boxes. And so just having some insight into the languages that your children speak, that kind of gives you some additional information. You're like, oh, I wasn't aware of that. And it's hard because a lot of times we have more than one language represented in a population. However, it does provide some helpful information as well.
When you're looking at language structures and verbal reasoning also, a lot of us probably have Spanish speakers. That was primarily mine, were Spanish speakers. And they don't have apostrophe S for possession. Okay, that's one real difference. So kind of wrapping your head around that if you're older is a little more difficult. And the other thing they don't do in Spanish typically is compounding. So that comes more from the German side of English, where we have house dog and dog house and all those confusing things. Okay, that's kind of mind-blowing if you're a non-English speaker or that's your second language, because you're describing the thing. You just keep adding to it, and so you end up, instead of house dog, you've got a phrase like this long. And if you've looked at, I love to do this, look at, because I'm weird, the directions on the back of a box, and it's describing, for example, a Tupperware, and it's describing what the Tupperware is. Okay, plastic resealable box in English, and it will be a paragraph in Spanish. Spanish makes up for it though, because the words are linked together, and so even though it sounds really fast, it is really fast. It's 30% faster spoken Spanish than English typically. And then basic literacy knowledge, and you know this from folks that move in and have not been taught to read in their first language. It's going to be an uphill battle. The other thing is, when children are born, the main thing they're focusing on is language. I mean, they're learning their muscles and things like that, but you think about it, they're sitting there and their form of communication is crying or smiling, and they're listening to this overwhelming amount of language. It's just streams of sound coming past them. And what's interesting is they're not linear learners like we tend to be when we're older, but they're taking everything in, and it doesn't matter if they're hearing 15 different languages. Their supercomputer brains are moving so fast, and they're busy establishing where the breaks in the sound are and finding the words. But what happens later is, so that's the part of our brain that's developing then. That's red hot, it's all activated, it's clicking along very fast. If you are a child, especially a child of poverty, or you've come in late and you're not getting as many words, your vocabulary is limited, you've not heard as many words, typically those synapses have been pruned, okay? So you haven't used it, you've lost it. Use it or lose it. Okay, that's what really, really happens. And you see this in children that have been locked in a closet someplace, and then later you're trying to teach them to speak. They have language impairment. They don't develop the language. It doesn't develop. So a lot of what you're going to inherit in secondary ed with reading problems, it's going to be much more difficult to teach this then, by the time they've got to high school, than when they were in 5, 6, 7 years old. So it really is a struggle. And it may not be learning disability, it's just the way the brain is wired at that point. And
as secondary people, we're not trained in this. This is not something that we're taught to do through our coursework. And the one thing that I mentioned in our earlier presentation, when we talk about language comprehension, if you're talking with members of your team or your department chair or your assistant principal or whatever, the big thing with comprehension is that it encapsulates so much. It's not a unitary construct. It's not phonemic awareness. It's not sight word recognition. It's everything, and that's what we are struggling with at this age, because not only do you have to try and bump them through this, but then you have so many other things that are on your to-do list with these students, and they're coming at a disadvantage, a lot of them, because they're lacking background knowledge, at least here in our venue. Let's see, I did also want to mention, Joanne was talking about with these, this is kind of like when we talked about the Stroop test with the colors and everything. It becomes increasingly automatic. You don't have to think about it. That reading will overpower. If I ask you what color this is, you may notice it, but if I want you to say blue and it's actually green or something like that, you're going to have a hard time with it, because the reading has taken over, because of the automatic nature of reading. These are more strategies that we're working on trying to do, and when those things do form together, this is where we get this fluent reading that we would normally see, and it takes years and years. So what you can expect normally is at the very lowest level, you're working with decoding the words on the page, and this is the receptive part of reading, because the words are there. You're not having to generate them out of your head. The words are there on the page, and you've got to decode them, and you've got to learn the sight words. So those two things together give us word reading. But at third grade, and remember, we've got them coming in at all different times,
whether they read or not in their first language. So at 3rd grade, we stop teaching them these word reading skills. They have them or they don't. And we move into reading for knowledge, okay? So we stop learning to read and we move into reading to learn.
So that's how you do it in your first language. How do you do this in a second language? So first of all, when a student's having difficulty in a second language, is it really a reading problem or is it a problem with language? And that goes back to what Joanne was talking about. And this quote here, the second language learner needs a minimum threshold level of general second language competence before they can generalize their first language reading abilities into the second language. And so if you have somebody who is a proficient second language learner and it's a good reader in language 1, the consensus is that the reading abilities can be generalized even when you have differing scripts, when it's a logographic orthography versus syllabic or whatever. Saw this and I thought, I'm going to pop that thing up there and let you all look at it and see if you think that sounds familiar. Yeah, if it's math, I can't tell if you don't get the math or if it's language. I don't know. Okay, so this is what we're trying to kind of tease apart here. So we do have the compounding issues. I just mentioned orthographies. We're just talking about the way a language is written. There are essentially 3 orthographies. There's an alphabetic one, and so that would be like what we use for writing in English. And then that can be divided into whether or not it's a deep or a shallow orthography, and that just has to do with a grapheme phoneme correspondence. If it's a deep one like English, what that means is that what you see written down does not necessarily sound like what the word sounds like. So you think about the words through, tough, though, and thorough, how those are really hard because they don't look like they sound. Then we have a shallow category. So if you have students who speak Spanish, the sound and the letter, they pretty well match up. And so those are some examples of deep and shallow orthographies. Then we have logographic orthographies where a symbol is representative of what it is that you're trying to express. And so old Egyptian hieroglyphics, where a symbol of something represents something else, Chinese. And then there are also syllabic orthographies where these break into particular syllables. So if you think about the Cherokee syllabary or katakana in Japanese, hiragana, those are examples of syllabic orthographies. And so we have all of this also going on that we have to contend with because they may be coming from a different writing system. We're going to talk about whether or not we're looking at a reading disability or part of the learning process for a second language learner. So the first part of this is about why can't my student read? And so Joanne, you want to talk about this a little bit and then I'll add something.
So as a secondary gen ed teacher, I struggled. Not even ELL, but my gen ed kids would come in and they would say, don't ask me to read aloud in class. And also, can you help me learn to read? And I thought, what in the world is going on here? And what I've learned is you have 2 things, you can divide them into 2 things. And you've got your word level reading that we talked about, reading the words on the page, and then you've got understanding what you read. And if you're reading the words on the page and you're understanding what you read, 2 thumbs up, you are a good reader. If you are not reading the words on the page, but you understand a lot of what's in there, you're looking at a dyslexic subtype, okay? This is a person that has difficulty matching up what they hear with the symbols, the letters, but then they can get a lot of comprehension out of what they're reading. If you've got somebody that can read the words on the page, and this is more generally what we see, but they don't understand, then you've got a poor comprehender. This is much more difficult and very common with our ELL students. Sometimes these guys will fool us because they can get the synthetic part of reading. They get the fluency and they'll zip right along and they have no idea what they're reading. If they can't read the words on the page and they struggle with comprehension, we've got 2 problems. We've got a poor reader. And in that situation, although we're trying to fix everything all the time while we're flying the plane, okay, we've got to go back and work on word reading first because that's where we're going to boost their vocabulary and everything and get the comprehension.
And as Joanne had mentioned, this is typically what you would expect an EL student to do, to be able to read what's in front of them, but they may not be able to really understand. This would be more of a dyslexic profile that we would see from a first language person. However, when you're learning a second language, this would look more like a dyslexic profile for a second language learner because they're having trouble reading the word plus they're having difficulties with comprehension, and that's why splitting this apart is so important. So, very important, first of all, when we talk about dyslexia, it is neurobiological in origin. If you had an fMRI, you could see something going on, and difficulties in dyslexia of students with dyslexia, a lot of times inability to rhyme, having difficulty with multisyllabic words. If they're writing a word in a paragraph or whatever, it may be spelled one way at the beginning and it may be spelled a different way at the end because they're having a hard time matching this together, and they can't maintain a visual representation of that word. A lot of times the memory piece, the working memory, is what's so problematic for them. Letters may be rearranged differently when they're spelling, and so dyslexia in itself is not just flipping the letters rather. It's because they don't really have much semblance to them. And spelling words versus the way they sound versus the way they look is another problem with dyslexia.
And when she says it's on an fMRI study, what you would see, the part of the brain that's lit up, and there are fabulous new studies coming out right now. University of Washington is doing an fMRI study right now with dyslexic students. What that looks like is you've got what's called a phonological processing loop, and it's right here in the brain, and it's really connected to your ear, to what you're hearing rather than what you're seeing. What happens in a typically developing person is it runs from right here, you see it, you code it, decode it, whichever way it's going, and it runs right over here to your short-term memory, quick. And then we're able to use all of that up here in the short-term memory to think about what we've read. With a dyslexic student, they're struggling with the words on the page, and it's taking longer because that root, instead of that direct root right here, is going around the head, right here, okay, the back of the brain, and coming in here. So you've got this lag of time, and you know we've got only so much short-term memory. It's short, so that leaves less time for comprehension. But that's what it shows up looking like on an fMRI study.
All right. We talked about the difference in the writing systems for EL students. So what do those problems look like if they are dyslexic? Okay, so if you're somebody who has difficulty in a first language with a deep orthography, like English, that's kind of like what Joanne was explaining. You want to go ahead?
So for my students with dyslexia, when you're looking at words like would, should, could, through, thorough, though, those are really difficult. They're a lot more difficult than some of your words like cat, but when you start getting into blends, particularly and front and back blends, shift, strift, stroifed, things like that, that becomes particularly difficult for students because they might even be able to sound out the individual sounds. They might get the st and the and then get stir and not stra. Even when they start getting those three together, they may have trouble with the back blends and putting all of it together. It's a little bit easier on words that are just very linear and don't have so many blends in them. Did you want to add some more to? That's the meat of what it looks like.
Yeah, because it's going to look like what we would see among English, because with that being the deep orthography. In a shallow orthography like Spanish, what you may see there is they can pronounce what they're seeing. However, they may put accent, stress, emphasis on the wrong syllable. So like the word cuchara, they may pronounce cuchara as they're reading, because this part's fairly easy. And I think it was Danish that we were reading about that was talking about that they were having, it's slower, it's fairly accurate, but your comprehension is what the piece that's being missed there.
And interestingly, even with logographic language, where you're looking at the whole picture and they miss the pronunciation or you miss the nuances of that picture.
In logographic orthographies like Chinese, if they're writing it, they may have difficulty replicating the strokes of it. And also because we're talking about language, and we failed to mention this earlier, but roughly 8% of the population, that's an estimate of EL students, are dyslexic, which mirrors the population of English and across languages. It's roughly about 8%. So they may also have difficulty picking up the tones because it's the language piece that we're seeing in here. And in syllabic orthographies, the decoding is problematic for them. So if you have a dyslexic student in your ESL class, these are some of the things that they would encounter in their first language. The same types of problems, but because of the orthography, it may present itself a little bit differently. So, is it dyslexia or is it second language? We had a great question yesterday. How long do we wait to see if this is a problem? How long should it take? And all. And unfortunately, the science does not say this long, and if it's beyond this point, then you have a problem, or if it's before this problem, everything's good. So it's very important to know our students in our classes. But these are some things that a lot of times are part of the normal learning curve, at least for some part of that. If they're not strong in their first language, and they don't have good vocabulary in their second language, that does not necessarily mean that it's dyslexia. That could just be part of this trajectory. If they're having trouble with phonemic awareness in the second language, it could be because they don't have vocabulary in the second language. And then also because when we have early and older readers, sometimes you have this cross-language transfer and interference from their first language. And so that may be an example of, I think the one I gave yesterday was in Arabic, the word park, because they don't have the p sound in Arabic, they may pronounce it bark. That's that cross-linguistic transfer that's going to interfere with that. These things are not dyslexia, but these are things you may see. Wanted to go ahead and put that back up there just as a reminder. The dyslexia part is a real thing. I'd mentioned this about knowing your student, knowing what their prior education was, their language experience, when you can get information from your parents, that's often helpful. Knowing your personal characteristics, knowing each individual student, and then also knowing what the cultural expectations are as far as reading, education, so forth. Another thing that's important for us to know is, when did they start learning English? When did they start becoming schooled in English? Has there been any interruption to the formal education process? These are all things that we see in our classes a lot. And
then another one is, have they had any instruction in their first language? It's a lot easier to bridge that over once you've got a vocabulary base if you have already been reading in one language. Okay, and then you start picking up and you're internalizing a lot of the vocabulary that you're hearing in your second language, you can bridge that gap and come over. If you haven't, remember, language development starts very young. So if you have somebody that has just moved in and they haven't had, they're in the 7th grade and they've not learned to read before, it's going to take a lot longer. So even though you may want to compare to their siblings, okay, well, this one that's 5 years younger is reading already, there must be a problem with this child here. Not necessarily. It's going to be delayed, significantly delayed, because they didn't have instruction in their first language. And that part of the brain is not developed. It's going to take a while to get those things clicking.
And then we know, as far as with BICS and CALP, you're going to see quite a difference in their abilities, especially with their academic language. How much opportunity have they had to work with the academic language in the classrooms? And then I also wanted to mention this when we talk about the language and culture, that real strong interrelation of those two, that a school may not offer something that is culturally responsive in its instruction to allow students to bring what they know to the table. That's always a consideration. However, the key thing here, and I wrote it down, I wanted to make sure I said it correctly, is whether a problem is persistent. So word reading, spelling, fluency, whether you have persistent problems in these areas, whether the student does not progress in a manner that's similar to peers that are in same backgrounds, and also persistent and pervasive problems that are despite this consistent and targeted intervention to try and help them. That's when you get that red flag. So I do have a student that has learning disability in reading. What can we do? One of the things that we can do, bless you, is within our classroom we can have word walls up there. A lot of us do that, or vocabulary banks and so forth. We can use scaffolding techniques to help our students. Pretty much it's good teaching. A lot of these things kind of validate what we do. And helping with word retrieval when reading is personalizing. When you're reading something to a student, then you have the conversation, okay, well, how would this play out in your case? I know Joanne's really good at this, but when
Well, there are a couple of things that I do. One is take the burden off of the learner, because speech production is much more harder than receptively dealing with the language. So find out what their comprehension is. Their listening comprehension is directly related to their reading comprehension. Read the passage to them, talk about some of the vocabulary, and see what they've gained from it, if they're able to give you enough language back to tell you what that passage was about. Another technique is when you're discussing a vocabulary word, is go ahead and write it on an index card, piece of paper, whatever, and leave it turned so the student can see it, so that they're able to access that without having to try to drag it out of their memory when they're already putting a sentence together for you to talk about, because this is very dense. I don't know how many of you have learned a second language, but it's exhausting when you're sitting there just drowning in another language, and then you're trying to remember a word that somebody gave you in a story if you don't have the story right in front of you, or even if you do, that's a lot of text maybe. You know, a paragraph looks like a lot if you're struggling with it. Go ahead and write that word down. It's not cheating. You can put it right there. And there's some games you can play with that too. If we have time to talk about techniques, this is pretty fun. Has anybody played Heads Up? You can get it on your phone and you put the phone up there, and so the people around you have to describe the word, and it's like $1 Million Pyramid or 100,000, whatever that pyramid thing is. Use all the words around it, circumlocution, so that the person that's holding the thing on their head can guess what the word is. So you can do that a couple different ways with even a little vocabulary book for each student or for a group. When you're working on something, you've written it down on a little card, it's right out there, they've been using it, they're comfortable with the word, and so maybe you play a little quiz game and you're pulling out all of these words. You know, you've kept your stack of index cards and you're, give me an example, what is this, what is this, what is this? So that's the easier part. Then you step it up once they're getting pretty good and they can tell you what soil is, and they can describe, well, you put a plant in it and it's another name for dirt. Then you go back and you give it back to them. Hey, what's that word? It's, you grow plants in it, and it's another word for dirt, and they're like soil. Then you know they've got it.
I think pair-share activities are also helpful with students who have reading disabilities. And other ways that text can be made more accessible to students. So if you have, I know with some of our programs, when we've adopted our textbooks, it also contains either, in the old days, a CD, or used to, we'd have a link where we could go where it would read the text that's being written, so that they're hearing it and they're reading it. And then of course you want to try and encourage the children to kind of track what they're reading. There's another site, and we'll put it on at the end of this, we'll add it to it, robobraille.org, robobraille.org. And you can take a URL, or you can just take some text or whatever, copy it, drop it in there. It will convert that. Now, of course, it's machine speak, so it's not a person with normal prosody speaking or anything, but it's still not bad if you have a passage that you want them to read. That way they're hearing it as well as reading it. E-readers, another, because sometimes those will highlight the words as they're reading those aloud. But the big thing is we want to help with the weak memory, and we also want to help them with their organization. So things like showing them how to take notes, teaching them how to take notes, how to organize, letting them see if it's expository text, the way that things are laid out, where you have a topic and then you may have a subtopic, and what the italics mean and so forth, so it kind of clues them in. So these are some things that you can do in your classroom to help support some of these students. And then I think, Joanne, you've got the last.
Well, I want to talk about guided reading too, because you don't want to forget guided reading. And this was something that I was a little bit unaware of until I went to, a lot unaware of until I went to elementary education, and I had a rock star reading teacher there, and she showed me all of the different ways you can approach a piece of text, and it works great for high school also. So you can take turns reading a sentence, and a lot of times I'll do that because remember, some of our 8% are going to have some sort of SLD, probably learning disability, and especially with children that have autism or something like that, they're on turtle mode. They have a really hard time. A lot of them, not all of them, because they're completely unique too. A lot of them will have difficulty with their fluency or with their prosody, so that their inflection and their tonal quality and things. And what you can do is you just are part of the group, and as you're reading a paragraph at their instructional level, they're not struggling terribly, but you are helping to push them up. You get to read now it's my turn. Then you get to read, now it's my turn. And when you hear them right after you've given a model, it's fascinating to listen how their tonal quality improves and how their fluency improves. They're unlikely to get bored with the reading unless they've just read it like a gazillion times, because there's so much going on in their minds, and they love to get their phrasing correct. They love to sound like they're a competent reader. So giving them an opportunity, hey, you've done a great job. Who wants to read the first paragraph? I don't call on students and make them read. And what I find is if I'm instructing at the right level and I'm supporting, nobody wants to get left out. I don't have anybody, they're going to knock each other over trying to I want to read the whole page. Can I read a paragraph? When are we going to, taking turns like that. It's okay once here's another thing. So every now and then we get lucky, right? We have parents that want to help. It's okay if the parent doesn't even read in that language. Send home that passage and let the child read it to them. Not just something they have never seen before, but something that's at their reading level. It's below their instructional level. It's something that's pretty easy, but they're getting the number of words, they're getting that repetition, and they're gaining that self-confidence. I give treats for whatever. And a lot of our businesses will give coupons, so you don't have to give candy. But they'll give a coupon like for a free pizza if they read this many words or something. I'll come up with something. It's amazing what you can get from businesses if you just go and ask. An ink pen, I mean, it doesn't matter. Pencil, a sticker. And the age doesn't seem to matter either. It's that reading success. But if you read the passage and you put your initials on there 3 times, your parents' initials, your brother's, somebody had to listen to you read. You read it to them 3 times, you bring it back in, we cash it in for something, a sticker, acknowledgement, I don't know. I have had students that will go, and I had one, he didn't have anybody at home when he got home, but he really wanted to participate. It was a class competition on who read this many words, and he dipped his dog's foot in chocolate milk. Read to the dog. and I said, you know what, that's great, perfect. I love your problem solving there. I don't want to think about the milk at home. But I'm excited that you are that dedicated to reading. Here are some legitimately fun activities that will help your students grow. And remember, if you don't see growth, you may not see it initially, but you can work on with these kids. Don't give up, don't slack, make every minute count, and it comes like a waterfall. All of a sudden one day, I don't know if you've had that experience, but you think they're not getting it, oh my goodness. And then all of a sudden it's just like a waterfall and it's all magically there, or a lot of it. And they're connecting across techniques that you're using. Phonics and sight words, okay, balance your literacy. Sight words can be really fun. Listening comprehension, this is great, especially with people that are new coming in. Read the text, discuss the text. You do the heavy lifting, you do the reading for them and see if they can get the comprehension or what words you've got to work on. And some of the reading comprehension strategies, there are a lot of different things to look at. We've done reading detective, pick out clues, look for the WH questions in there. Can you answer these things? Can you give details back? You want them to be able to connect to background knowledge, so maybe make a web of what this connects to other things we've read or things that you know, and offer time for students to share that, because the process of thinking about how this relates to me is what makes that, makes them think. When they're not with you, they're starting to think, okay, how does this relate to me and what I already know? This is just a quick handy hint. I use it on my husband, it works beautifully. Instead of asking, what do you think? Ask, what do these words make you picture? If you're dealing with your husband, instead of asking, hey, what do you want to do this weekend? Or what do you want for dinner? And he's going, I don't know. Great, I'll just stop and get a big bag of I don't know over at McDonald's. Ask, what do you picture us doing this weekend? My husband never pictured us doing anything until I asked it that way. And he's like, hey, I picture us going camping and fishing. And I'm like, what? This is news to me. I picture that too. Let's do it. So change your vocabulary around just a little bit. That simple phrase of what do you picture for this gets them thinking, oh, I need to be looking at these words. These words are supposed to be making me picture something. They're not just floating out there randomly. And we're not trying to regurgitate it for a test. We need to be thinking what these mean. Guided reading we've talked about, and repeated reading for fluency, accuracy, prosody, and speed. And don't forget They're going to be excited about repeated reading. You might be bored hearing the same thing 47 times. Probably not, because you're celebrating every little word that they get correct and their phrasing and things like that. I mean, you're probably pretty invested in your kids, right? They're not going to get bored with it until they've just exhausted that piece of literature. Okay, here, and this is also up on the website at writingreading.com. Acronyms, they change every 5 minutes. Feel free to email me when you have more acronyms to add to this ongoing list. There's several different things I pulled from other folks, IDA, International Dyslexia Association, Dyslexia Basics, and these are just some of the websites, but they're more up on writingreading.com.
So this is her contact information as well as the website writing. It's not WRI, it's making it right, writingreading.com.
Do we have any questions? I know you have
Question
questions.
about, and you all may or may not know this, our teacher ed programs, are we teaching secondary undergraduates how to teach children how to read?
You're not. We just had that conversation.
I mean, I'm just, do you know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm thinking to myself, like, how could I talk to my secondary folks about, middle school and high school, about word walls? Middle school teachers, 5th and 6th grade will do it. After that, it's hard to get them to do that.
Yeah.
But that's an easy thing they could do.
Right, and if they knew how it worked, here's how it works with us guys on the classroom floor, right? We're struggling with 5,000 different needs going on, and our feet probably hurt. And so what we're looking for are the things that we know work. And if they know why it works and they have a way to implement that's easy, they'll give it a try. They'll at least try it, because we're all looking for a better mousetrap. What does tend to happen is that we don't know, we hear all kinds of crazy things, and personally for me, this is what happened. I was at high school for 12 years, and I really love my kids. I was invested. These guys have no resources, and I'm their other mother. They've got their mother, but I'm their other mother. That's what we used to, and I'm your school mom, and I'm watching you, all of you. I know what you're doing, I know what you're thinking, and don't do it. So I got a lot of feedback from the kids. I put out a survey at the beginning of the year. It was one of those things I did that was just like lucky, because I didn't know what I was doing. And it was, the title of it was like, It's All About Me. And I just asked random questions like, what are 3 things I need to know about you? What are your goals? Things like that. What do I definitely need to not do? And almost, I'd say about 40% of my students would say, please don't call on me to read aloud in class. I can't read well. The other thing, there are 2 other things that they said that were fascinating to me. One, their goals for the year, every single one would put down, I want to get all A's. Everybody wants to be successful. And I would know they weren't just goofing around, because they would put goals like their weightlifting goals for football or whatever. And then under the things they're worried about, because I want to know, what are you worried about coming into my Spanish class? And a lot of times they're worried about their own behavior. Sometimes I have a hard time controlling myself. I'm not a good student. I can't keep up with homework, things like that. But they all want to be successful. Most of them don't want to read aloud in class. And I would also get these little messages on there that said, I can't read. I really can't read. Every now and then, can you help me read? And it broke my heart. And I thought, I don't know what to do. Nobody told me how to deal with this. I don't know how to teach reading. What am I going to do? So I thought to myself, this is ridiculous. Those elementary teachers, they only have 20 students in their 1st grade class. By gosh, if I was a 1st grade teacher, all of my students would know how to read. So I thought, okay, well, I'll go teach ESL. And I was a co-teacher, and I taught a bilingual class with a rock star. Thank you, Mandy Black. Rock star 1st grade teacher. And I realized it was a miracle anybody learned to read. And I thought, oh my gosh, how are we going to get kids? They're never going to learn to read. How am I going to get, I'm not prepared. Fortunately, she knew what she was doing, and I still realized, and everybody was learning to read, and it was a battle to the end, but I realized I still needed more information. And she was just a natural talent. She looked for things on the internet. She tried all sorts of new, innovative things that I would look at, and she'd be like, she'd bring something in that she found on the internet, and I would say, it's never going to work, Mandy. And she would say, let's give it a try. I think it will. And I was amazed at how many times these things would work. Sometimes they didn't. But not being secondary teachers are a little bit more worried about failing and goofing around in class, and their students are going to realize they don't know what they're doing. I mean, that's always going on in your head. Like, I got to keep, these are young adults, and I got to keep on top of this stuff. Whereas your elementary teachers are more willing to take chances and things like that. I think an idea of continuous quality improvement, we're always trying to improve, and I always told that to my students, hey, every single class is different, every single year is different. Give me some feedback, what do we need to do to change this class? How can we make it better? I'm gonna try something today, and you let me know if you like that, if you think it would be helpful, or how can we improve on that? And the kids will give a lot of feedback too, but one of the things is to try to foster a community of innovators, or a sense of it's okay. If you're not failing, if you're not screwing up sometimes, you're not trying enough. You're not trying enough things. Every day is not gonna be smooth, and that's okay. If you really get to know your kids and you are demanding, because you know how it is, you get kids in the classroom and they hate each other. They've just tried to kill each other in the bathroom, okay? They come in the class, and the rule has always been, if mom ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. Come in, be happy, leave it at the door. Leave the problem, and I had a caution tape right across the door. Leave it outside, because if it kills all of us, we're gonna be nice to each other in this class. If it kills all of us. And if, and sometimes it's been a little bit rough, things have gone wrong, and we've had to say, time out. That's not what this is about, okay? Regardless of what we learn, we're gonna be nice to each other. If you have that, where people know they have to be nice to each other, they will end up being nicer to the teacher and let you take more chances. So things like that word wall that looks really elementary, you have a chance to look at that as a reference, and the kids aren't also like, I don't really want to have to rely on that, it looks elementary. That's the other thing, is we don't want it to look elementary. We don't want to be thought of as little children, which we still are, even though we're 18 in these big adult bodies. And then the other thing is, they will ask, why can't we do group work? Why can't we do centers like we used to do? Why is our classroom not decorated like the elementary teachers? Why do we not have that anymore? Those things are, those are tangible for students. So that's another thought. Maybe a little bit off track, but it's kind of the whole atmosphere of trying new things.
I think when I had my certification courses and all, I had content area reading. That was it. And in fact, as she and I were both coming into Murfreesboro, we were talking on the phone today, and I was telling her exactly this. I said, I was expecting to go in and learn something about, like, what if you get a kid that can't read? What do you teach? It wasn't any of that. It was, when you look at that reading rope of Scarborough, everything that I had was all in the comprehension domain. But some of these very fundamental, basic skills that you learn, from the bottom up ones, I didn't know anything about that. And that wasn't even for my ESL certification. That was for Spanish, when I had to, because I had taught at a private school with just a bachelor's in language. And when I came into public school, I had to come in on the interim license and take some courses from there. And so, yeah, it was just a 712 content reading course. Thankfully, there were some really good things in there that I was able to do. But ever so often, you still get this kid who comes in and baffles us if we're secondary people going, how did this happen? And it's kind of like with what Joanne says, when you're thinking, what happened before they got to me? Was the teacher like, not there or what? And then when you see how many things can go wrong in reading, then you're like, oh, okay, I may be willing to give that person a break, because there's a whole lot to it. But I think at least in undergrad programs in the state, you're just really not taught to teach how to read. And so then at the secondary level, when you have a kid who has these issues, you're sort of at a loss. And I know at one school, I had gone down to the special ed office because I wanted to take a look at the child's IEP, and the teacher acted like she was the gatekeeper. Oh, well, what do you want to see this for? It's my student. I need to know. Well, you'll need to make an appointment. I mean, it was a very surreal experience and all, but a lot of times you have these obstacles that kind of keep you from, so when you get into your classroom, a lot of times you feel kind of isolated. When you know something's wrong intuitively, we know if something's not right. And even though there's not this checklist between, if they haven't achieved this by this time, there's a problem. You know. And so when you try to go for help, yeah, it's problematic a lot of times. So that's why one of the reasons we wanted to try and split this out so you could say, okay, this is probably language, this is most likely dyslexia or reading disability, and then what things can you do in the classroom to support?
Regardless of what you call it, you can call it special ed or you can call it second language, it doesn't matter, your child still has the same needs. So it's all about trying to figure out how to address those needs. A lot of times if you do have a student that's certified special ed, and by the time they've gotten to middle or high school, your child's been certified generally. It's very difficult to get somebody certified at that point, and it's going to be a battle here, and for a good reason, but there are some things to consider that as an administrator, you would look at that and say, okay, I've got a child who's in my general population counting for me once for the school score on reading, and then, or math or social studies or science, all of those things, and they're probably missing social studies or science to come and get the reading, the ESL. And if they're certified, and they're in a special category, so the special population ESL, they have to make a certain gain. And then when we certify them for special education, that's another special population, and they've got to make that gain, that arbitrary number that we put in there. So that adds another layer of burden on the school. I understand, I don't like it. On the other hand, I understand that if we didn't measure that, then people might throw up their hands, and they might also say, well, that person's second language learner, learning disabled, can't do anything. We're just going to park them over here. So I get the tension in there, but it makes it really difficult when you're looking at, being responsible for school scores and also being responsible for scheduling. And your gen ed teachers are going to, they're going to want students that are able to pass these tests, and if they've not been in your class because they've missed half of science all year long because they're having to go to another intervention, they tend to resent that, right? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand.
If a student is diagnosed as having a reading disability, the question is, if a student has a reading disability, they have a reading disability, it doesn't go away, am I right?
Right, that's correct. You can remediate dyslexia to a large degree. There are fMRI studies now that show that we can, if they're young enough, reroute these neural pathways in the brain. Okay, these are brand new studies that have come out with intensive intervention when they're much younger. But some of the characteristics will always remain. Remember, traditionally it's a phonological processing thing, so they don't hear the sounds in all of the words. So this is why I'm interested in this. I'm married into a family of dyslexics. So I'm like on this end of the scale as far as language, and that's where I live and love, and I'm swimming around in there and I'm all happy, and then I marry into a family that language is not their thing. And it is not just reading the words on the page, but a lot of times it's the intelligence is there, the comprehension is there, but the words aren't quite right. So for example, if you're talking about brine, the salty solution that you put your turkey in and you let it, soak for a few days before you cook that sucker. But sometimes I hear brine with an M. Okay, that comes out. A fellow was over at our house and we had the hurricane coming through back in the fall. I forget which one it was going to hit Miami, and he says, that hurricane is going to come in there like a salami. And I'm like, tsunami, that's what he's talking about. So those words, he knew, he had a mental picture, his comprehension was good, but the words are kind of changed around forever. And you're going to have your vocabulary, like your reading vocabulary, you can get to be a good reader, but it's going to be a smaller, live in my world. That's all I can say.
Just picturing it coming in through like a salami.
You saw a picture of a salami, right? Yeah. We're picturing a big old, salami going down the streets of Miami. The vocabulary that they read with tends to be isolated. So if you have a Charles Schwab, for example, that finds out later in life, he's hugely successful, very intelligent. His daughters granddaughter's diagnosed with dyslexia, which is a heritable trait. They start tracking it back, and he's like, hey, I have those same characteristics. He only reads the financial section. He's got a sheltered vocabulary, a limited vocabulary. He has difficulty with the rest of the New York Times.
One of the things that I see as I track students that have been identified as special ed in the elementary, so then in middle school they test out, and I think, okay, are we over identifying ELs in the elementary that were too quick, and really what all they really needed was time?
Yes, and that does happen quite a bit.
And so that's a concern that I have is so there's just it's very difficult to know, is it language, is it a reading disability, and does the student just need more time and more reading instruction?
More reading instruction. And so there are two things that I'm really passionate about. One is I do believe, I know RTI sometimes is burdensome and we don't like to talk about it, but in theory, it is an excellent system that if we implemented it correctly, provides immediate support without having to identify a child as having a specific learning disability, but we can get them the tiered intervention help that's focused on their deficit area immediately, and then get them back out if they don't need to be there, instead of putting a label on them that they have trouble testing out. At least we have RTI where we can test them out. Before we really implemented that, once you were in, you were a lifer, because if you had that second language issue going on, and you were SPED, how your reading disability, even if one problem resolved, the other one kept you from testing out, right? So yes and no. If it's a comprehension problem, that's much, much more difficult to resolve. But when you're looking at a L2 student, you're going to have trouble with vocabulary. And if you don't understand the words, how do you differentiate between comprehension and?
Typically, if all they really needed was more time, when they get in about 6th grade, it just clicks, everything comes together, and it's like, why was this kid ever taught, sometimes labeled as SPED, he is definitely not, and then you're just like, and they go on
And another problem is very often you have multiple different teachers trying to teach the one student, and maybe you don't have a systematic explicit phonics program that you're starting with. We're too quick to change programs.
Our problem is not our problem is great word callers, and then they get to
and then they don't have the comprehension. Probably they're not. If they're testing out at that point, then it's a vocabulary issue or idiomatic expressions. Think about that. It's raining cats and dogs. Hey, free pets for everyone. Those are tough. They're really tough. And I listen a lot of times and I think, wow, how does anybody understand what I'm saying? I try to eliminate a lot of that from my speaking, but the language is tough, making inferences is tough. If you've got a reading comprehension problem, making inferences is difficult, and if that person has trouble making inferences in their first language, that's a really big indicator that there's a problem in their second language. That would be something that would jump out at me. How many people have trouble with having access to interventions? You have a closet full of different interventions or parts of interventions, but you don't know which one to pick or how to use it. Yeah, and maybe you've inherited somebody else's stuff and it's boxes, and yeah, that's really tough. As an administrator, I will say that a lot of what I learned was I was lucky to get some professional development in specific interventions. So that helped me use the product. And when I got that help, one of them was Readwell, K and Readwell 1. And I can't even say that I liked the trainer very much at all, because I thought she was rough on my students. But she showed me some different ways to use the program and how to use it with fidelity that made life a lot easier and a lot better for my students, and we made a lot more progress. And if I had not had that help, I was pretty dedicated, but at that point I was married and I wanted to go home and spend time with my husband. I didn't want to have to drag these books home and read an entire manual that I may not understand on how to use the intervention.
I think a lot of times the fidelity kind of gets a bad name as well, because at least in my district, sometimes I talk about, with fidelity, with an eye roll and everything, but there is a reason that these interventions are to be carried out the way that they are, because the studies, when they went to find what was effective, it fit this. And so even deviating just a bit may make a change later on that we're not aware of there. And so I think
eliminating a part. A lot of times our scheduling doesn't match up with whatever the intervention calls for. So the intervention calls for an hour, and guess what? We have 45 minutes or 50 minutes. You know, it never quite matches up, and it's difficult to, you know, we need to eliminate parts, or we don't want to roll it over to the next, you know, part of it to the next day. But a lot of times some of these interventions, and I'm not talking about all of them, and I eliminate parts too, but you have to think, are we missing out on comprehension? What are we giving up for the parts that we snip out of there to try to make it fit our schedule? And that, if it's balanced, a lot of times it'll come in later and you get the waterfall effect, like you're working, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, this baby's not learning. And then all of a sudden, 3 months down the road, there's a cascade of information that just pours out, and that's the way language happens. It's not linear. Just because they didn't understand this part doesn't mean they're not going to keep seeing that again and again, and so everything comes together as a whole.
I think for an administrator, that's a good thing a good conversation to have, because, you know, of course, the master scheduling is definitely an issue, but when you educate them on some of these factors, I think that's helpful, especially if you have a good advocate, if you have an ESL office at your central office or whatever that can also explain this to the school leaders, because scheduling is a big concern, making sure that the students get the time that they need, because what we keep seeing is time. And the fact of the matter is that time gets shaved off here and there, and, you know, it's a pep rally, or it's a, you know, fire drill, or it's a this or that, and then there goes your opportunities. And so a lot of this that we have issues with, are we just providing sufficient time for them to learn?
When it comes to time, here's an interesting fact. If you're looking at a child and they're not ESL, okay, this is just a child who is not even got a reading disability, but they've missed instruction, they've had poor instruction, whatever, you can expect for every grade level that you've got to catch up on reading, it's going to take at a minimum 80 hours of instructional time. Okay, so between 80 and 120 hours. I think comprehension is much more difficult. So if you've got a child that's come to you in 6th grade and they're reading on a 2nd grade level, and you're getting them for 45 minutes a day, you know, you're spitting on a fire, a conflagration, a big problem. And I think a lot of people don't realize how much time, and that the fact is reading is the #1 thing that we are supposed to provide children with when they come to school. That's the first thing we have to teach them. It's the most important thing we do. And yet, teacher prep, we don't get enough information on how to do it properly. We don't often get enough support in the classroom to figure out, while we're in there with a bunch of kids, what in the world to do, especially for the ones that aren't learning typically, or to differentiate, because every single child is different. And then when you start adding things on there like second language, reading disability, language disability, those sorts of things, autism, hearing impairment. A lot of times you've got children that will come in, I've seen a whole lot come in from Central America with a hearing impairment. It's not been remediated, right? They've not had hearing aids or anything until they're much later in life. They're 4th, 5th grade, 6th grade. I don't know if any of you have seen this or not, or they're completely deaf, and that makes it very difficult to teach them to read too, because they don't hear the sounds, first language or second language.